It takes less than a month to put a new face to the country. May the 11th saw presidential candidates registering with the Interior Ministry until May the 16th. And June the 18th will see ballots cast in Iran. Today we'll be looking at procedures filling the gap, the vetting of hopefuls, their election campaigns, where they come from, and what institutions have the clout to direct all the above into an acceptable future. Marzi, and you're watching Iran Today. Presidential elections are held in Iran once every 4 years. The general process is that after the candidate's 5-day registration time frame with the Interior Ministry, their eligibility is reviewed within 10 days maximum by the constitutional vetting body known as the Guardian Council. This council has 12 members, 6 legal experts and 6 clerics. Winning at least 7 votes in favor is approved. Approved names are sent to the Interior Ministry. From the day names are finalized till 24 hours before election day, candidates can campaign. Elections are then held in a day with results to follow the next day. 592 people registered this year for the presidential race. After 10 days of vetting and consultations, the Guardian Council announced the approved candidates on May the 25th. The list is as follows: Ebrahim Raisi, Mohsen Rezai, Mohsen Mehralizadeh, Saeed Jalili, Ali Reza Zakani, Abdul Nasser Himmati, Amir Hossein Qazizadeh Hashemi. Now these candidates have 20 days to campaign for the presidential. Ms. Masumeh Ebtekar is current Vice President for Women and Family Affairs. We met her at the Vice Presidential Office for Women and Family Affairs.
We have always witnessed high voter turnout in Iran. Women and men have taken part in determining their future and destiny through elections. This is the strength of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But we've been facing a propaganda war against our country for the past several years now. This is part of the war waged against Iran, an economic war and a propaganda war. Our country has been facing
may expect a reformist hopeful to win the seat of president, although many may be ready for a change of scene to principalist. But in Iran, election results have traditionally swung in favor of the dark horse or shadow candidate in the last few days running up to election day. Mr. Ghulam Reza Mesbahi Moqaddam is a former MP and Ayatollah, currently member to the Expediency Discernment Council and Assembly of Experts. We got to meet him at his office in Imam Sadiq University.
The events of 1997 showed us that when everybody believed Mr. Not in the ballots, and that it wouldn't make a difference whether to vote or not, but we saw that it didn't happen. The candidate that garnered people's votes, Mr. Khatami, won the election with 20 million ballots, against his rival with 7 million votes. Mr. Nateq also congratulated Khatami on his victory. We have had this experience, and it can certainly happen again too.
خاتمی با 20 میلیون رای رقیب خودش رو با 7 میلیون رای کنار گذاشت.
Having mentioned JCPOA considerations with the turnout and vote, it's worth mentioning that nuclear deal is not Iran's only foreign policy factor for it to be a total determinant. With the JCPOA's failure to deliver, Iran struck a 25-year deal with China. Also, a very partially exploited, several hundred million strong regional market. Mr. Naqabi Hosseini is a former MP, well versed with the law and eloquent in putting the country's political system into a legal and historical context. He gave us his time in a legal office of breathtaking elegance. He is currently member of the Front of Islamic Revolution Stability.
اصولگرایان مورد اقبالند. واقعیت اینه.
The principalists are in luck. This is the reality. There's a tendency toward principalists in the society because reformists and moderates can't be accountable for Mr. Rouhani's performance. Even reformist figures like Mr. Aref try to depict Mr. Rouhani as a placeholder president who isn't a reformist. They are right, of course, because we have known Mr. He hasn't had a reformist background, but anyway, the cabinet has been the cabinet of the reformists. Many reformist ministers were in this cabinet. That's why principalists are now critical of the two past cabinets and hold people accountable who call themselves reformists.
Serious presidential candidates tend to formally register as candidates a few hours prior to deadline for a position that will see them preside over the highest strategic decision-making body as well as the country itself. That's the Supreme National Security Council. The constitutionally mandated composition of the council also, however, awards a seat at the table to each power of the state, judiciary and legislative as well as executive. Strategic cabinet ministers and the leader of the revolution or his representative also each. The president, as chief of the executive, governs how things are done to manage and steer the country. But that's not unsupervised and at times even vetoed. The Supreme National Security Council prevailing policy orientation will be the policy of the Iranian state, not necessarily policy preferences of the president. Do comment on the leader's words, calling for a government that wants change. What would such a government look like?
The leader of Iran's Islamic Revolution has always emphasized on people's participation, presence, role, criticism, and protests. It's important to note that his view is that people must have a permanent and active presence. His second view is that there should always has to be a turnover in the country's elites, that we shouldn't repeat the past. This is something to be noted. If the elections are held and the same people with a different form win, the same people who have been in office for the past 40 years, we can't expect any change to come about. People are looking for a government that would bring about profound changes.
More than 59 million of Iran's roughly 85 million population are eligible to vote, under 1.5 million of whom are first-time voters. People may vote either way for economic reform. They may vote for a reformist with a greater tendency for diplomacy and international relations, or for a principalist who can provide cover for reformists to come to terms with the US and Western partners to the JCPOA. Can be lifted off this country. That is drawing on accounts by analysts abroad. Because looking at it from within Iran, the system is pretty unified on wanting talks to yield results, without, again, giving a mile to take an inch. The third scenario is that the turnout will be too low for reformists to stand a chance, looking at last year's parliamentary elections, whereby voter participation fell to 42%, a record low. Plenty more to be said, but time to give others a chance for a word or two. So stay with me for a quick media review to see what other outlets have to say. And here it is in words. Shinhoanet points to the conditions for candidacy, some of which the government had a problem with, for example, group. World Insight, spotlight on heavyweights in Iran's presidential race as betting begins. To exclude a large number of the individuals who register every 4 years as potential candidates with very basic or no qualifications, the Guardian Council on May the 5th approved an amendment to further clarify the criteria based on which it vets the potential candidates, according to the Council's official website. Orf, who heads the Interior Ministry's election headquarters, said the lower number of registrants for this year's election compared to the previous votes has proven that the Council's move to clarify the criteria has been effective in bringing greater rationality to the registration process's general atmosphere, the IRNA wrote. In the 12th and 11th elections, hopefuls stood at 1,636 and 686 respectively, Orf said. According to the amended criteria, hopefuls must be between 40 and 70 years of age, hold at least a master's degree or its equivalent, have work experience of at least 4 years in managerial posts and with no criminal record. Analysts say the main chances of winning the vote could be of the principalist and reformist parties, the two main rival political camps in the country. Looking at oil price, would it make much difference to the US really whether a reformist, a principalist or moderate gets in with the Iranian presidential elections? The US shouldn't hold high hopes for a pro-West Iranian president. The US and Iran have been engaged about the resuscitation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, the nuclear deal, for some months now, following the US's unilateral withdrawal from the treaty in May 2018. So far, little progress has been made on any of the key issues involved on either side. There are hopes in some quarters of the US State Department that this data, in conjunction with the election in Iran on 18th June of a new president, will result in a softening of Tehran's stance towards accepting the tougher clauses that Washington wants to include in any new nuclear deal. These hopes are likely to come to nothing, though. There are those Iranian politicians that believe that more engagement with the West will get Iran more of what it wants than more engagement with Russia and China, certainly. And there are questions of Iranian attached to that, but that is not an ideological difference, just an economic one. But at the core, all Iranian top officials believe in the mottos of the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which are independence, freedom, and Islamic Republic. So although they might have different approaches toward Iran's problems, at the end of the day, they all have a deep distrust for the US. The Star points to a new development on social media in the run-up to the elections. Iranians find their voices on Clubhouse ahead of poll. As Iran gears up for a presidential election, people from across the political spectrum are taking to the audio app Clubhouse as a rare forum for debate inside the country. Chat rooms have been sprouting up every day on the invitation-only social media platform, some of them attracting thousands. Politicians from opposing factions have found their way to the app, along with an array of analysts, journalists, and Iranians, both at home and abroad. Clubhouse's main drawcard is that it has created an opportunity for dialogue between people who could not bear talking to each other before, said Farid Modarresi, an analyst close to the moderate camp of incumbent President Hassan Rouhani. The hot topic on their lips has been the hopefuls who have been coming forward and registering to be candidates for the 18th June presidential election. In an editorial in April, the news agency Tasnim said Iran's foes could cause security, social, and political problems for the country through Clubhouse. In an interview with AFP, the Guardian Council's spokesman Abbas Ali Kadkhodai said the body saw Clubhouse as potentially constructive as long as committed. That will be it for the news segment, but do stay tuned. More coming up. Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time.
What right do you have to live here?
The right I have is that the owner of the house wants me to live here, and he wants there to be Jews living in his house, and I got chosen for whatever reason. It ended up being me.
I put the kids to sleep in our bedroom so that when we die together.
Many members of Congress have instead fallen back on a blanketed statement defending Israel's airstrikes against civilians.
It is to understand that what's going on in Gaza today is unsustainable. When you have 70% of the young people unemployed, when people cannot leave the community, when hospitals and wastewater plants have been destroyed, that is unsustainable.
There has been a face-off between the Guardian Council and the presidency over candidacy criteria. President Rouhani ordered his Interior Ministry to ignore the Guardian Council proclamation because he believes it has no legal authority to impose new, more restrictive qualifying criteria on candidates. But the council said it would refuse to consider candidates as formally registered if they fail to provide all required documents, including a lack of criminal record and no history of dissent. And the new criteria have, by the way, been backed by 200 Iranian parliamentarians. Although candidates here like to stress they are independent, there's political currents in the background which they are either akin to or which back them up. To introduce participating in this year's elections, they are the current critical of the Rouhani government, that's Raisi, etc., the current aligned with the government, and the current supportive of the Rouhani government, which is reformists. This is not to forget independents running for office.
In a religious democracy, the people's votes are really influential and decisive. You have witnessed in the past elections, for example, that the whole electoral system was being managed and administered by a political faction, but someone from a rival party won the election. For instance, in 2005, when all the administrative bodies were supportive of Mr. Hashemi Rafsanjani, but people voted for Mr. Ahmadinejad. The same happened in 2013. This is a matter of pride.
Democracy, Mr. Naqvi Hosseini said why it's so important for a system to run on working political parties. Because Iran has hundreds of parties, but how functioning they are is another matter.
The fact that the person is elected but doesn't make good on his words afterwards goes back to the problem of not having a parties-based political system, because the candidate hasn't been backed by a party to be held accountable after winning the vote. The US Democrats are accountable for the president's performance because it was the party that collected the votes. The president has won as a Democrat, but because the principle of parties hasn't been established well in Iran, the candidate feels free to do whatever he wants after taking office as president. It's because there's no party to admonish him.
192 candidates, including 40 women, had registered by May the 19th. I asked what gave the 40 women the confidence to apply as prospective presidential candidates this year.
This is the culmination of a series of policies that we've implemented that has been successful in terms of engaging women in the decision-making processes in the country. We started the beginning of this government 8 years ago. About 5% of the managers in the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran were women. Although it's stipulated in the Constitution that women have no, there's no option for women's advancement. Imam Khomeini, the leader, have never made any obstacle for women's engagement in politics or in running the affairs of the country. But there have been glass ceilings. What President Rouhani did was that he put forward a strategy, particularly from 2017, that is his second government. He set a quota that 30% of the managers appointed in this government have to be women.
What tends to happen in Iran is that candidates on each front tend to pull out in favor of the winning card closest to their camp.
It's important that candidates from the two rival political camps compete, even if it doesn't result in polarity of votes. But people have to be able to prefer one over the other. There has to be a meaningful ground for preference. We can say one of the candidates is good, but the other is better. Or I can remember there was a time that we said one of the candidates was bad, but the other was worse. So we need to do something so he wouldn't take over. What I believe is crucial is that people understand that our current economic and social situation isn't acceptable at all. Especially over the past 8 years, things haven't been improving, but even regressing. Of course, both domestic and foreign factors were involved, but proper management makes a difference.
To what extent would you say political factions in Iran have reached political maturity, having seen 4 decades of the revolution go by?
مسلماً جریانات سیاسی بعد از حدود 40 سال.
Certainly, political movements have gained the necessary maturity after some 40 years of activity in Iran. There are some occasions when they face problems and doubts, but it's not because they're not mature enough. There are other reasons for that. The main one is the lack of parties. We don't have large and relatively inclusive parties. They're too small.
Talking of parties, under Article 26 of the Constitution of Iran, the formation of parties, societies, political or professional associations, as well as religious societies is permitted, provided they do not violate the principles of independence, national unity, the criteria of Islam, or the basis of the Islamic Republic. In the early years following the 1979 Islamic Revolution, political parties in this country were divided into right-wing and left-wing, basically in the economic sense. Today, most parties can be classed as principalist or reformist. These are 1990s adaptations of right-wing and left-wing. Then there are moderates, the incumbent Rouhani government, and independents, basically speaking. To move on to ideology or political agenda, principalists say politics and religion are inseparable. They support a minimized government role in the economy to the extent mentioned in the Constitution. They view the globalization of economy with skepticism, special emphasis on retaining independence from foreign countries. Reformists, on the other hand, seek to execute the constitutional rights of the people and work toward enhancing political freedom. They opt for a promotion of interaction with the international community. As for the term moderates, it surfaced in 2013 with Hassan Rouhani's presidential election. Moderates are widely believed to be left-leaning. They advocate employing diplomacy and refraining from using harsh rhetoric.
The other end of the spectrum are reformists who believe in the principles of the Islamic Revolution, abide to the Constitution, but are very forward-looking in their policies. And they believe that we have to have a progressive approach when dealing with Islam, because Islam is a religion for all times, and we have to engage in a dialogue which should be constructive but also can be critical dialogue with our young generation. To enable them to engage with the theoretical dimensions of the Islamic Revolution, to engage with some of the practical dimensions of what has happened all of these years. So this is what the reformists believe, and they believe that we need a constant reform of laws, of policy, practices to be able to preserve the principles and the spirit of the Islamic Revolution.
A spectrum of political party colors being out there is no accident. Iran calls for diversity among candidates in upcoming presidential elections. But given this is a religious democracy in contrast to a Western liberal democracy with no title, I asked if that actually meant all walks of life in Iran will be covered by varied candidates and political parties.
It's always been like this. I mean, during elections in Iran, we've always had candidates from the two major political camps, the reformists and principalists. It would certainly be the case in the upcoming vote too.
Political factions post-revolution to pre-revolution.
Political parties that were active before the revolution were Shah's puppets. We used to have the Iran Novin Party and the People's Party. Shah dissolved both and formed the Rastakhi's party and called it the Sengel Party, saying to anyone who'd oppose it to take their passport, obtain a visa for another country and leave. There were no independent parties that relied on the people before the victory of Iran's Islamic Revolution.
It's not just the 13th presidential elections the country will be holding on June the 18th, but the 6th election for the city and village councils, as well as midterm elections for the Islamic Consultative Assembly. Also, the Assembly of Experts elections will be held on the same day in some provinces. Western political pundits, the media, politicians, frequently criticize this country for not being a democracy in their eyes. But not much is being said about authoritarian Arab kingdoms in the region. Why they can't see a democracy in common between religious democracy and Western liberal democracy calls for an answer.
Because they don't see their interests and their profits in the independence and the strength of the Islamic Republic. Because if the Islamic Republic of Iran proceeds as a successful model of an Islamic democracy in today's world, we're going to have a lot of problems with different entities which exist in the region, which are more or less dependent on Western governments for their economy or for their political system. They don't like to see a successful model of an independent state emerging.
That's it for today, but the story is only just beginning. So do watch at the same times next week and each week after, and every day in the last week running up to the elections, as we'll be having special editions on. Thanks for watching, and bye.